Welcome to Women in International Law, a podcast of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights and the Atlas Network.
Join us and hear from women with varied experiences and career paths in the field of international law.
Coming up in this episode,
a career is a long period of time and that pathways are not always straight. So even if you have a goal, you don't always get there by the straightest route. Sometimes it's more circuitous.
Greetings everyone, I'm Nathalie Mivelaz Tirabosco. I'm the Head of Communication and External Relations at the Geneva Academy. And I am thrilled to introduce Lucy McKernan, our guest for the first episode of our podcast, Women in International Law. Lucy is the Deputy Director for United Nations at Human Rights Watch, Geneva office, where she is responsible for advocacy work at the UN Human Rights Council and other UN human rights mechanisms. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Lucy was the Geneva representative for the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, where she established and led the Geneva office and conducted advocacy on economic, social and cultural rights. Lucy is a qualified lawyer who practiced in Australia and was the director of legal services at Justice Connect, where she undertook national law reform advocacy on homelessness and access to justice, and was responsible for pro bono legal clinics, providing legal advice and representation to persons experiencing homelessness and to older persons. It goes without saying that we have the perfect guest to delve into a conversation about a career in human rights advocacy. Therefore, my initial question for you, Lucy, is precisely why human rights advocacy? Was this your goal from the beginning?
Hello, Nathalie. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to the podcast and for the question. Yeah, so I suppose I have always wanted to work in human rights. Perhaps at that time I described it more as social justice. When I was studying law back in Australia, where I'm from, there was no human rights course in the university that I went to, so I framed, what I wanted to work on more as social justice and fighting for justice in the world. But as I said, I started, I took law, and then the pathways in Australia were not clear, I think, to work on human rights. So I started in private practice in a commercial law firm, which was quite a common pathway at that stage in Australia where I was starting my career, and then moved into human rights later on in my career.
Good, and thanks, Lucy. Can you highlight a particular moment or experience that you consider pivotal in shaping your career path in human rights?
Well, there are a couple of points, I suppose. As I said, I was working in private practice. The law firm that I worked for had a very strong pro bono practice, which means, lawyers who are providing services for free to people who couldn't afford legal services on what I would describe as social justice issues, public interest issues. So I was very involved in that program at the firm I was working at. So that was probably one of the first inspirations, if you like. I also took a leave of absence whilst I was working there to go and work for Reprieve Australia. But I went to the US, to New Orleans, where I worked at an anti-death penalty legal service called the Louisiana Crisis Assistance Center. And so my job there was helping the lawyers who were representing people either on death row or facing the death penalty. And that was an extremely inspiring experience too. I mean, for me, it really showed me a pathway, how I could work on the things that I really wanted to work on with the skills that I had already developed as a lawyer.
And how did you move from this more local community work to the Geneva scene, which is more global and working with international human rights mechanisms?
Yeah, so I moved with my family to Geneva in 2013. And so then I looked for a job more in the international space. And that's when I started working with the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It was a good fit for me because my work at the Community Legal Service back in Australia had been quite a lot on homelessness and issues for, helping people who were experiencing homelessness. So then, when I came to Geneva, this job at the Global Initiative came up. It was a new role for them in Geneva, so my role was to sort of establish the Geneva office and represent the organisation there on issues relating to economic, social and cultural rights.
And what type of advice do you wish you had received when you started your career and that you did not get?
I do remember some advice that I got that I thought was very good. That wasn't your question, but from actually one of the partners at the law firm I worked at, very wise woman who emphasised to me that a career is a long period of time, and that pathways are not always straight. So even if you have a goal, you don't always get there by the straightest route. Sometimes it's more circuitous. And I thought that was really good advice, that there are different experiences that you can get doing different things along the way. You can kind of meander more in your career to get to where you want to get to. So, yeah, I thought that was helpful. In terms of advice that I didn't get, I suppose it wasn't that I didn't get it, but it's a difficult question to answer, I think, and that was, how to manage work-life balance. That's the conundrum that many of us face in our careers, particularly if you have children, which I do. So I had lots of great advice from women that I worked with, but really I think the answer is one that you need to find yourself in terms of the balance that works for you, and it's not easy.
Yeah. Have you, and that's a bit in relation to what you just said, have you encountered any specific obstacle, and how did you navigate them, and were these specific to being a woman or not necessarily?
Yeah, I think that the one on sort of work-life balance and where you have children to look after is a tricky one. Perhaps not an obstacle, but a challenge at least, that I needed to manage. For a lot of my career, I did work part-time when I had young children. So I worked 3 days for a while and then 4 days for a long time. And I think you can fall into that trap of working 4 days nominally, but in fact doing 5 days in the space of 4. So I think, as I said, I think it's about trying to find the balance that works for you and for your family. I think I found the balance at certain points along the way, and then it was disrupted by things changing, of course. So yeah, that's one of the challenges for sure, and particularly, I suppose, being a woman. Although I think it's a similar challenge for men, and certainly one thing I found with my male colleagues who had children around the same time was that there was less of a expectation that they'd be working part-time. So my husband, for instance, worked part-time as well when we had young children, but it was less expected, and people were a little bit surprised to find that out. So I think that's a challenge also for men.
Thank you, Lucy. Now moving to your current job at Human Rights Watch, how this job now for a big human rights organization doing advocacy at the UN differs from what you've done for like a smaller NGO like the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. How does this advocacy differ from these two institutions?
Yeah, they are quite different in some ways, although I suppose based on very similar skills, the skills that you develop. When you work for a smaller organisation, of course, you're expected to do a lot more of everything. So there's not a big human resources department behind you. There's not a finance department. You have to do these smaller things yourself. And I think that in some way that was really valuable experience, because I learnt skills that I wouldn't have otherwise learnt. And those sorts of functions now at Human Rights Watch are performed by others. So I have to do less of that. I think working at a smaller organisation also allows you to be more nimble and responsive, or flexible, if you like. Whereas obviously with a big organisation, there are sort of restrictions on what you can say, and you need to be consulting with all of your colleagues across the world. before you can take action. So, I think there's a flexibility and nimbleness that I like about small organisations. But on the other hand, obviously with Human Rights Watch, it's hugely beneficial to work at an organisation that has a very strong reputation, is known across the world, particularly known by the media. So it makes it easier, I suppose, to do your advocacy because the doors are already open, if you like. So at a small organisation, you might spend a lot more time trying to get into the room to have the conversations, whereas at an organisation that has an established reputation, you get invitations to meetings and so on to speak. And then, your job starts with the advocacy then. So I think, there's different roles that they play.
And do you think you make a difference with your advocacy work?
I really hope so. It's always the question, isn't it? Is this really making a difference? We do get feedback from states, certainly the states that I engage with here in Geneva, that our messages are helpful or are listened to within the bureaucracies that they represent. So that sometimes is satisfying to hear. I suppose, we acknowledge we're only part of the ecosystem. We're one small contribution to the bigger human rights movement, and I hope we make a valuable contribution in that way.
And what skills are essential in your work today, according to you?
So I suppose I would say advocacy itself is a skill. So influencing people is really a skill that you need to develop. Also building relationships. A big part of my work is having strong relationships of trust and confidence with diplomats who I engage with my colleagues within the organisation, with other NGOs with whom we collaborate a lot, and obviously with UN agencies and UN experts as well. So I spend a lot of time doing that sort of networking and relationship building work. And then the sort of advocacy skills. And I think there it's about, identifying who your audience is, what the levers for change are, what are going to be influential arguments. I think also, as I said, kind of collaboration is a really key part as well. We, at least here in Geneva, the NGO groups work really well together. So I spent a lot of time talking to my NGO colleagues from other NGOs working on human rights and collaborating with them to sort of build campaigns together towards our shared objectives. So that sort of collaboration work is really important as well.
And you've seen the field evolving as well, because you've been here for quite some time. Are there new skills that are needed now that were probably not that necessary or needed a few years ago?
Perhaps on the technological side a little bit. The use of new technologies, increasingly is an important part of our work.
And how do you remain motivated and engaged in your work? Human Rights Council sessions after sessions, crisis after crisis. How do you continue to motivate yourself?
I think the most motivating and stimulating part of my job is working with our experts. So Human Rights Watch, we have experts who do the research, who are on the ground, researching the human rights crises around the world, and then they come to Geneva often, and we do rounds of meetings together. I find that incredibly inspiring to hear their work, the depth of their knowledge and understanding of the issues, but also when I work with human rights defenders, and so those are the people who are really experiencing these situations, and that was the same when I worked at the national level. I really valued the time that we were able to spend with clients, but also with people who were formerly homeless who'd become advocates themselves. So people who have really lived life experience. That's that I find the most inspiring part of the job, and it reminds you, why we're doing what we're doing. kind of grounds you, I suppose. So that, and then the other part, I think, is kind of really believing in the human rights and the legal frameworks that they can do the job, and that they can be relied on to force governments and rights abusers to comply with the law.
And do you have some main achievements to share in human rights advocacy? Like something you really think you managed to, with you and the campaigns and working with other organizations, to really achieve?
Yeah. I mean, there are different things. I suppose at Human Rights Watch, one of the main achievements I think that I was really proud of, and my colleagues who also worked on this, was the establishment by the Human Rights Council of a commission of inquiry on the situation in Ethiopia some years ago now. Unfortunately, that commission of inquiry recently, its mandate was not renewed, but when it was established, it was a very difficult campaign for its establishment at the Human Rights Council, but on an incredibly important issue, because it was such a brutal conflict in Tigray, the Tigray region of Ethiopia at the time. And there was, it really felt like the establishment of this commission of inquiry did represent the possibility of accountability for the victims that we were seeing in that conflict. So that was one I suppose, achievement. I also worked, when I was at Global Initiative, on the campaign for the recognition of the right to a healthy environment, which is a very significant moment, I suppose, in the human rights movement, when the Human Rights Council and then subsequently the General Assembly recognised the right to a healthy environment as a human right. And I think that was a really significant moment. For me, it was sort of the closing of the circle, if you like. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when it was established, environment was not really seen as part of the discussion around human rights. And there's been a very significant evolution since then, I think. And it seemed to me that this was the moment when there was a recognition that for someone to live a dignified life, you also need to pay attention to and provide a healthy environment, not just the rights that we already saw in the UDHR. So that was a pretty significant moment. And also I think because it was such a huge coalition, it felt like a great mobilisation of NGOs, but also Indigenous peoples groups from across the world. So it was quite felt very, very joyous and celebratory when it was achieved.
So thanks, Lucy. We're almost close to an end of our discussion and conversation, and I have one final question to you. So if you had to start again, what would you do differently?
That's a difficult question. It's hard to know. I would have liked to start my human rights work earlier in my career. As I said, I did start doing in commercial practice, which I found very valuable in terms of the skills that I built, and I found the work interesting and I made a lot of great friends, so I don't regret that, but it probably wasn't my home, my natural home. So I would have liked to start that earlier, but as I said at the time, there weren't very clear pathways. So I probably took a slower path to get where I wanted to go.
Okay. Is there anything you would like to add or comment on this advocacy work and career as a woman?
Yeah, I suppose I would like to say that I find it really enriching and stimulating work, and for me that's really crucial. That your career is a long period of time. It takes up a lot of your life, and so you want to be doing something valuable in that period. And so for me, a career in human rights has provided that. And the other thing for me is, it's about the people and friends that I made along the way, because they're people whose values strongly align with mine and who are, also passionate about the things that that I think are really important in life. So it's also about, the people that I met and the friendships that I made that I really value.
So many thanks, Lucy, for this conversation, and many thanks to all of you for listening to this first episode of our podcast, Women in International Law. Goodbye.
Thanks, Nathalie. Goodbye.
Thank you for tuning in to Women in International Law, a podcast by the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights and the Atlas Network. If you found this episode inspiring, be sure to subscribe for more insightful conversation.
Stay updated for upcoming events featuring women with diverse experiences in international law at geneva-academy.ch and explore inspiring women's profiles and interviews at atlaswomen.org.